We're going to talk about two organizational-wide organizational development interventions, high-performing systems and learning organizations. And within each of those, there's going to be a few kind of interventions we're going to talk about. And really what we're moving forward to is high-performance systems and learning organizations are both ways to kind of conceptualize interventions that are going to be affecting the entire organization. So the amount they affect the organization and how hard they are to implement and how much drastic change is involved is going to change from intervention to intervention. But really what is defining these is trying to find various OD interventions that will augment or allow better decision making or better processes across an organization compared to a lot of the policies we've been talking about or programs we've been talking about that are usually a little bit more aimed at specific issues. So these are system-wide interventions, organizational development interventions aimed at a change within a total system. And kind of like I said, they can vary in the severity or the amount of change, the drasticness of the change, and also what actual systems are being impacted by the change. But basically, if we're looking at an OD intervention, that the intention is to affect all parts of the organization somewhat equally or create a system which is going to impact all systems within an organization, we're talking about a system-wide intervention. So organizational development is a systems approach to group and interpersonal relations. So everything we've been talking about is within open systems model. I think the easiest way to kind of think of these programs is that instead of us looking at one part of the open system that we're targeting, we're usually trying to implement something that may impact the entire open system. And system-wise interventions examine organizational design, so we can be looking at how the actual entire organization is structured, including who reports to who, how many levels are there, how many departments. That can be a system-wide intervention. Organizational flow patterns, so basically how communication occurs, how workflows occur throughout the organization. But we can also still be impacting or affecting interactions of individuals and groups. So how do people actually work together? What is their experiences of work on the job? So one of the first and probably easiest ways to do a system-wide intervention, trying to create a higher performing system, is survey research and feedback. And a lot of organizations have implemented some form of this. My wife actually works specifically in this field. So she is an industrial organizational psychologist. She works for a very large Fortune 500 company, and she is specifically in charge of their survey research and feedback department. So she is conducting yearly surveys, trying to basically measure corporate climate, employee engagement, job satisfaction, to provide data back to the organization to look to see where there's problems and then to come up with further interventions to address these problems. So when we're looking at survey research, we're usually trying to measure employee attitudes to serve two important functions. And really, again, why this is system-wide is usually we're talking about not a department that is doing targeted surveys to small parts of the organization, but actually organizational-wide survey data being collected in a systematic way. In other words, it's not just happening once. It is a yearly process, a quarterly process. There might be short surveys. There might be a long yearly survey. And that data is being used to not only communicate with employees, but to also generate data to make better decisions. So basically, it has two main functions, an improvement tool and a communication tool. And I want to talk about each of those briefly. So for an improvement tool, you can start to look at trends in the data from year to year, from quarter to quarter. You can start looking for areas that need improvement. So is there a lack of job satisfaction in certain parts of the organization, at certain levels of the organization? And then that can be an indication that additional organizational development is necessary to address those problems. But it's also an important communication tool. So we've been kind of talking about how one of the assumptions of organizational development, almost kind of backward, main theory behind organizational development, is that we're trying to empower employees. We're trying to make them more integrated into organizations. We're trying to make sure that employees have the tools and the connections to actually be involved with their jobs. And this is another way at a very organizational level to provide a communication tool to employees. And we're going to talk about some of the findings of adding a survey research and feedback program to an organization. And one of those we usually find is an increase just in the fact that we're collecting this data in perceptions of job satisfaction, commitment to the organization, and to some extent, employee engagement, so how engaged they are in their jobs. Also, the types of questions being asked in these surveys can be used to also communicate what the organization thinks is important. So a lot of times, for example, if you're measuring climate or culture in an organization, you're also asking questions about key organizational goals or organizational competencies that are often being communicated already through various statements within the organization. So it's another way to communicate that these are important. And when you're creating a survey system, it's important to ask, are we doing both of these? If all we're doing is gathering data that's going to be used for improvement, we're probably missing a golden opportunity. But also, if all we're doing with the survey is just using it to reinforce what we're already communicating and we're not using the data for anything else, either of those is focusing on one and not the other. We want to focus on both. So the steps to survey research and feedback, step one is basically, again, top management decides that they're going to start doing a survey. And again, I think the key important part here is to really focus on trying to convince top management that this needs to become a cyclic process where the data is being gathered on a regular basis, where employees get used to the surveys, but they also start to understand the value of the surveys, and they see the surveys are actually driving changes in the organization. We usually want some form of outside staff to give the questionnaire and an outside staff to summarize the data and give feedback to the organization. So this can either be done through external consultants, or if there is going to be surveys done completely internally, there needs to be a survey department that has the legal and managerial support to defend the data that's being gathered. And really what I'm trying to focus on here is the need for that summarization of data to give feedback to the organization. The top management should not get the raw data from a survey. And there's a lot of ethical reasons for it, but there's also a big business reason, and that is that the value of a survey, half of it is communication. And if people are worried that their specific results will land in the CEO's desk and that CEO will be able to see exactly what they as an employee said in the survey, you're not going to get good data, you're not going to get honest responses. So they have to trust the system. It's easier to trust if you're dealing with an outside consultant. And I'd say about half of my work as an outside consultant for organizations is actually conducting surveys and feedback for them and writing reports. And I will guarantee you, well, I don't have to guarantee you, I can tell you, just honestly, I have never worked for an organization that at some point I've gotten an email either during the process or after I'm even done with the process where someone high up in that organization's administration asks, hey, can you send me the raw data? And fortunately, I actually have them sign a contract saying that I will not do that under any circumstances. And then I include that in all of the communications that come with the survey that I'm administering to that organization. So I don't share that data. There needs to be that level of trust. There needs to be someone in the organization. It's easier for someone outside the organization to be able to set that up and stick to their guns. My wife is challenged by this because she is an internal person doing these, and she has the same thing. It's very rare that they run a survey where someone, including all the way up to the CEO, at some point says, hey, can I see the raw data? And she has to be the one to say no. And fortunately for her, she has it written into her contracts, and the legal department of the organization she works for defends her right to basically protect that legally privileged data. So once you actually have the summarization of the data, then you can start looking at it as an improvement tool. So how do we actually get that information to work groups and other departments so they can diagnose problems and develop action plans and basically create additional interventions to handle the problems that the surveys have identified? So research on the results of survey research and feedback, when done correctly, and like I said, correctly means that you are creating a well-made survey that is both addressing questions of identifying areas for improvement, but also communicating core values. You're doing it in a cyclic way to employees are realizing and seeing that changes are being implemented from that feedback, and you're doing it in a way that you're defending the original raw data from being used against employees. We generally find positive changes in employees' attitudes and perceptions as a result of implementing a survey and feedback program. We tend to see greater involvement of members producing greater change. So we also see more buy-in on individuals in an organization if they're being asked to change a structure or they're being asked to change something within their work group or their department, when that change is also being backed up by data from the surveys of their own members, their own responses, that often resolves them feeling as if they've had a bigger voice in the decision to make these changes. And feedback combined with other interventions results in more substantial change. So again, the fact that we're getting feedback, and if there is an intervention that is targeting a problem that was identified in a survey, if that change is actually then shown to actually change the survey results the next time the survey is done, it gives more feedback and more information that this is a successful intervention. So another thing we can talk about, and this is kind of another step forward, is a learning organization. And this is kind of, I'll admit, a bit of a buzzword that you hear a lot in business, that we want to create a learning organization. We want to move more towards being a learning organization. Honestly, I'm going to talk about this for a couple slides, but it really can come down to a stronger focus on human resources and developing those resources within the organization. So a learning organization is about basically creating a culture that values the employees and values them as individuals that need to be developed and to encourage to continuously learn. So some organizations fall into the trap of worrying that they will overtrain their employees to the point where their employees will leave them. A learning organization is basically the more we invest in our employees, the more likely they're going to stay with us, and we're going to go with that model. So this is usually a system-wide change program, a top-down program, which is changing the culture of an organization to focus on spending time and resources on developing individuals within the organization. So if you're taking this class as a part of an actual educational program that your organization is helping to fund, that would be an example of a specific intervention as a part of changing an organization or as a part of a learning organization. So also within a learning organization is usually also an emphasis on reducing organizational layers. And this is more of a byproduct that if you're actually continuously developing your employees, you're training them with additional skills, you're giving them more knowledge, by that very nature, that means you're also creating employees that are going to be able to make more decisions on their own and take more ownership in the organization itself, which usually means you're also going to see a reduction in managerial levels because you're empowering the individuals again. The involvement of all employees. So basically, a learning organization should not be just a learning organization at one level. Basically, it should be a philosophy, a culture, if you will, that at all levels employees should be developed. Usually, we'll also see in learning organizations a very strong focus towards internal promotion as well. So there's kind of this focus on a continuous self-directed learning, not necessarily dictating that people must take additional training, but definitely making opportunities available for people to learn new skills, to develop the skills they have, and to make it clear that the organization supports such decisions. We generally find, research finds, it leads to positive change in individual, team, and organizational performance. So individuals tend to become better employees. Teams tend to work better because a lot of times they're actually getting team training. And the overall impact is we find that most organizations actually thrive as they move more towards this kind of very strong focus on developing their human capital. Also, a learning organization tends to develop a continuing capacity to adapt and change. So the more you build up skill sets in everyone in your organization, the more you empower your employees, you also are creating an organization that more and more people are actually on the lookout for how could we do things better, how can we change, how can we adapt. So the core values of learning organizations. So a value, this is basically kind of the cultural level that's going to be happening at the top of the organization that's going to dictate these changes. Valuing different kinds of knowledge and learning, basically kind of having an open mind to what skill sets might be useful. So generally speaking, you want to make sure that you're not falling into the trap of only allowing development on very specific skill sets, because you start to make people that are very specialized, but also people whose careers may start to stagnate as they only have one set of skills. So at lower levels, for instance, not necessarily shying away from letting people take leadership classes prior to actually becoming leaders. Encourage communication between people with different perspectives. So again, often we'll find that an learning organization is also going to be very much focused around kind of a team-focused perspective, because we're also empowering people to communicate. It does to tend to develop creative thinking and remain non-judgmental of others and their ideas. So this is another thing is kind of a part of a learning organization is also a willingness to discuss ideas and to really give each idea its time in the sun, if you will. So not to shut down ideas, to basically go, well, I can see reasons why this idea wouldn't work, but let's also think about why it would, and let's see if there's any part of this idea that can be useful. And that kind of again encourages communication, going back to point 2, and also develops further creative thinking, going to point 3. You want to break down traditional barriers. So a learning organization often is not necessarily the standard way of kind of a hierarchical business, and recognizing there is going to be some resistance is usually a part of building up a learning organization. Developing leadership throughout the organization. So the idea of, again, empowering people to make choices as much as possible. Reducing distinctions between members. So basically trying to break down that there's still going to be clearly, obviously, people whose job is to make more important decisions, larger scale decisions, but there should be a less feeling of hierarchy, a lesser feeling of being unable to communicate ideas simply because someone's at a higher level within that hierarchical structure that's still there. And just a recognition that every member has untapped human potential, and anyone within an organization can be developed to become better at their jobs. So we've kind of been moving from just a general thought of survey feedback to kind of more high-performing systems, and then kind of moving towards a learning organization. We also want to talk about, re-engineering or more radical redesign. So again, this is going to be a high-performing systems. We're trying to change the entire system of an organization, but we're also changing the actual structure or the way work itself happens. So the previous systems we've been talking about are more specifically aimed at kind of fostering communication, fostering empowerment, fostering commitment across an organization, with a byproduct that additional communication, those additional skill sets being built up, will also result in the organization having better processes. Sometimes we need to be more radical and actually change the processes directly, and that's what we're talking about now. So radical redesign of business processes to obtain drastic improvement. And I sometimes refer to the difference between organizational development and organizational transformation. And again, the distinction being that organizational development is a gradual, purposeful process that gives the time necessary to make these changes and to minimize resistance to changes. Organizational transformation is generally when there is an external drive that's making us have to go faster than we normally would. So radical redesign, drastic improvements, is usually going to be hitting that gray zone of moving from OD to OT. So the idea is to make all processes within a system more efficient to gain a quantum leap in performance, emphasizes product and customer satisfaction and improvement in the process. Really, from an OD perspective, we just need to recognize when we're in a radical redesign kind of situation and to be thinking about what can we do to minimize the ripples, if you will, of doing such drastic redesign is going to cause in our employee workforce. So steps in a re-engineering process is to identify all the key business processes. So basically to kind of go through and create an open systems model of the organization. Identify what's currently being measured as performance and what are the key goals that need to be measured, that need to be improved. We then re-engineer the process and organize work around the processes, not the functions. So what are the key processes and how do we actually redesign work, not on individuals doing a particular function, but grouping them into the larger processes that are getting to those performance goals. And then implementing redesign process with continued reevaluation. Last thing I'm going to talk about is system 4 management, and this is just another way to kind of conceptualize a system-wide intervention in OD. System 4 management models are based on research of organizations and basically, again, coming up with a model of how we can describe organizations on a continuum on some key kind of traits, if you will, the personality traits of an organization. And the idea here is to find out within each of these traits, where does the organization lie between a bureaucratic, quote unquote, ineffective organization and a participative, effective at the other. So this is kind of, again, an assumption that in most situations, a very multi-layered organization with decision making very centralized at the top, and beyond that top level decision making, almost everything else just being a funnel for those decisions to make their way down through the organization, is a bureaucratic one and is going to be ineffective in most cases as far as comparing it to more of a participative organization, which is what we've really been talking about a lot of our interventions causing a more participative organization where, again, we have employee empowerment and decisions are being moved down that ladder, if you will. So the four management systems in this model is systems one are exploitative and authoritative. So they're basically top-down and autocratic. Not only are they bureaucratic, not only are they highly hierarchical, they also tend to be very much based on rewards and punishments as the only tools for motivation. So this kind of, if you've ever taken any business classes, you may have heard of the idea of theory X versus theory Y. Theory X is basically a management theory that says employees are lazy, they don't want to work, and they can't be trusted. And therefore, the job of management is to create a system to punish those behaviors and to reward people when they actually step up, but not to assume that people will step up on their own. Theory Y is the belief that if you give employees power, if you give them empowerment, if you give them interesting jobs, if you create a supportive work environment, you don't need to use rewards and punishments anymore. They'll work because they want to work. So system one is a theory X kind of position, very exploitative, very authoritative, very top down. System two is benevolent authoritative. So it's top down, it's still going to be a bureaucratic system, but there's at least a recognition of human value and human resources within that organization. It's less skeptical or less negative in its view of its employees. System three becomes more consultative, so we've actually looking at a benevolent authoritative system that actually has feedback going upwards. So now the decision making is actually being informed from lower levels. And finally, system four of the four management systems is a participative one where as much power and empowerment has been given to the lower levels as is reasonably possible to still make sure the organization is attaining its goals. So then how we determine where an organization fits on this is a series of actual questions about the communication, leadership, and policies of the organization. So we have three key dimensions of each of these. So how is downward communication accepted? How is upward communication accepted? What is the direction of communication? Leadership are areas of subordinates, are ideas of subordinates sought and used. What is the degree of warmth and support between subordinates and their leaders? And to what extent are the rewards and encouragements given to subordinates? And finally, policies. Are the policies clearly understood? Are there lots of rules and policies and procedures a person has to get to know to get their job done? And are there many unnecessary procedures? And the more you find yourself on the left side of the spectrum, the more you're in a system one. The more you find yourself on the right side of the spectrum, the more you're on a system four. And notice that the actual anchors of these scales change depending on what the question is. So really, we're looking at this as a diagnostic tool to basically go through, and sometimes this can be done through survey research. Sometimes it can be done just sitting down with top management and really kind of self-analyzing. And sometimes it might be done through observation with an outside OD consultant. And once again, once you've charted a profile of an organization, you start creating interventions, typically system-wide, to move the organization from system one to system four. Now, there's an assumption here that system four is the right fit for all organizations and system one is the wrong fit for all organizations. I would put a caveat of personal concern here. There are going to be some jobs where system one is going to be a more effective way of dealing with them when dealing with employees than with system four. Now, I could make an argument also that long-term, that organization would probably benefit from trying to change their entire business model to move to system four. But a lot of times, trying to just cookie cutter Take an organization, for example, a fast food franchise. A fast food franchise is going to be fairly low on a lot of these questions. In other words, there are going to be a lot of System 1 answers here. But trying to just move that entire organization to a System 4 may very well take more resources, more time, and more changeover in employees to where the organization itself would collapse through the process. So we do want to be careful that we are thinking about what is the right system for this organization. So we might think in that case, let's not move it from System 1 to 4, but let's see if we can get it from System 1 to System 2. Some common elements in the System 4 organization. So System 4 is, again, that final layer, full participative. It's going to be very similar to learning system or learning organizations. Actions rather than further analysis, decisions involving subordinates, not superiors, individual accountability without rigid policies, and recognition of teams and individuals, not blanket expressions of thanks, are all going to be kind of common elements that you'll see in a Systems 4 organization.